Hello everyone, and welcome to the lecture on creating tables using the create table statement. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to create tables directly in a SQL editor by using the create table command. So previously, we've already seen how to use the GUI in the very beginning to restore a database and fill in data. And throughout this section, we're going to learn how to actually use a SQL editor to interact and add things to the database. So here we're going to learn how to create a table. So if you were using a direct SQL editor or you were using the command line to interact with your SQL database, you could use these type of commands in order to create tables in your database. So to create a new table in PostgreSQL, you use the create table statement. And that's going to look like this as far as the basic syntax. You'll have create table, then your table name, and then in parentheses you'll say the column name, then the type, you'll have a column constraint, comma, and then some sort of table constraint. So, and then you can also inherit from an existing table, meaning you inherit properties from an existing table, and we'll discuss this as we show you examples later on. But let's go ahead and break this down just a little more line by line. So if we look at this first line, first you specify the name of the new table after the create table clause. So for example, if you were trying to recreate the customer table, you would say something like create table customer. Next, you're going to list the column name, its data type, and column constraint. So you can have multiple columns in a table. That just means each column separated by a comma. And I'll show you how to do that later on, but basically you would just have a bunch of these statements separated by columns and separated by commas, excuse me, and each of those would be a column itself. So the column constraints define the rules for the column. And an example of one is not null, and we'll go through the various types of column constraints in just a little bit. But as far as this next step, you're just listing the column name, its data type, and then its column constraint. Then after the column list, you define a table level constraint that defines rules for the data in the table. So you have the column name, the data types, the column constraints, and then some table constraints. After that, you specify an existing table from which the new table inherits. So it means the new table contains all columns of the existing table and the columns defined in the create table statement. So you actually don't need to inherit from another table, but sometimes it's a lot easier if you already have a table to go off of to build a new table. So just keep that in mind. That last part is optional, and it really depends what you're trying to do and what kind of table you're trying to create. So continuing on, let's go ahead and go over just some basic PostgreSQL column constraints. So there's not null can be an example of a column constraint, and that basically means the value of the column cannot be null. So if you're inputting values into that column, you cannot input null. So that's a great way to make sure if someone's using your database, they can't skip or not put anything into that column or that row. Then there's unique, and that's a column constraint, meaning the value of the column must be unique across the whole table. So you can imagine that's useful when you need those unique values. However, the column can have many null values because PostgreSQL treats each null value to be unique. So just keep that in mind, that even if you have unique as a column constraint, you could have many null values because PostgreSQL is treating each specific null value to be unique. And notice that the SQL standard only allows one null value in the column that has the unique constraint. Then we have some more column constraints that we can use. And those are primary key is one of them. So this constraint is the combination of not null and unique constraints. So you can define one column as a primary key by using a column level constraint. And in this case, the primary key contains multiple columns, so you must use the table level constraint. And we'll explore table level constraints after we finish all the options of column constraints. So far we have not null, and that constraint is that the value of the column can't be null. We have unique, and that value of the column must be unique across the whole table. And then we have primary key, meaning this constraint is just a combination of not null and unique constraints. So you can define one column as primary key by using a column level constraint. And then moving on, we also have the check constraint. And check enables to check a condition when you insert or update data. So for example, the values in the price column of the product table must be positive values. And then you finally have references as a column constraint, which constrains the value of the column that exists in a column in another table. So what that means is that basically you use references to define the foreign key constraint. So you can just think of references as defining the foreign key constraint. And then as far as table constraints go, they're basically similar to column constraints, except that they're applied to the entire table rather than to an individual column. So again, if you can say unique column list to force the value stored in columns listed inside the parentheses to be unique. And then you can say primary key, pass in a column list to define the primary key that consists of multiple columns. And then you can also use check and references in a similar manner. So I think all of this may be a little difficult to digest if you're just seeing it as slides. So what we're going to do is actually show you some examples of creating tables directly in a SQL editor. So that's probably going to be the most useful way to actually learn this type of information. So what we're going to go ahead and do is walk through an example of creating a table. And we're going to create the following tables. We'll create a simple role table, which has a role ID and a role name. And you can note that the data types are defined there as well. We'll have an account role table, and then we'll have an account table. So let's go ahead and jump to pgadmin, create a new database, and then start creating these tables directly through the SQL editor. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump to pgadmin now so we can get started. Okay, so here we are at pgadmin, and what we're going to do is go ahead and you can create a new database for these tables to go in, or you can actually just put them into the database we've been working with, DVD rental. So that's kind of up to you. Let me go ahead and review with you how to create a new database. So I'm just going to go ahead and right click on database, then click new database, and let's go ahead and call this I don't know, learning database, whatever you want to call it. Click OK. We'll go ahead and create that database for you. So here I have learning. I'm going to go ahead and double click it, and then once I have it selected, I'm just going to click here and execute arbitrary SQL queries. And now I'm going to go ahead and write the SQL queries to create the databases, or create the tables, excuse me. So we have our database created. Let's go ahead and create tables for it. First table we're going to make is that account table. And that account table is going to have a few columns to it. It's going to have a user ID, a username, password, email, a created on column, and then a last login column. So let's go ahead and get started. So first thing I need to write is create table, and then I put in the table name. So in this case, we're going to call this table account, and then I have an open parentheses, and now I'm going to start putting in the columns. So again, the syntax for this is the column name. So the first column we'll call user underscore ID. Then we're going to have some sort of data type. So the first data type I'm going to use here, if you recall from the integer data type lecture, well, the lecture on data types in general, I'm going to go ahead and use serial. And remember that one kind of auto increments, or is the same as auto increment in some other SQL engines. So that's basically makes sense because when I add new users, I want to make sure they have their own unique ID, and it keeps automatically incrementing. So I'm going to use serial there. And I'm going to label this as primary key. And then the next column we're going to have is username. And the username is going to be some characters, right? So it needs to be a character data type. And we're going to go ahead and say it's going to be variable characters. Since we don't know what people's names are going to be beforehand, we just need to set a limit. So remember that was VARCHAR. And then in parentheses, you set some sort of limit. We'll go ahead and limit it to 50 characters. And then we have some column constraints. This column constraint, let's go ahead and make it sure it's unique. That way we don't get usernames confused. So you can imagine when you're logging into a website, sometimes they say, oh, this username's been taken already. So here with unique, I can help that happen. And then I'm going to go ahead and also put not null as a constraint to make sure they just don't leave it empty. And you can kind of start to get this idea of what these SQL databases actually look like on the back end of some sort of web service or application as you build and create these tables. Let's go ahead and make another one, another column that is. We'll call it password. And password is going to go ahead and be, let's say, VAR, some variable character. Again, we'll give it a limit of length 50. And we'll say it just can't be not null. Doesn't really matter if people's passwords are the same, right? We just want to make sure their usernames aren't the same. So then we'll have their email as another column, and we'll also make this variable character. And let's go ahead and make this a lot longer. Since emails can be a lot longer, we'll just say 300. Let's say 355. Doesn't really matter for this case. I mean, it's up to you. And let's go ahead and make sure they have a unique email and that they don't leave it empty. It's just not null. Then we'll have, let's go ahead and say we have two temporal data types. So we'll have created underscore on as a column, and that's going to be a timestamp. And we'll just make sure it's not null, meaning we need to know when they created their account. And we'll have a last login column, so we know when they last logged in. And that will also be a timestamp data type. And then we're just going to close that parentheses and put a semicolon there. And let's go ahead and run this. And it said query returned successfully with no result. So that makes sense because we just created a table. We're not actually asking for anything. So let's go ahead and make sure this actually all worked. So if I go back to pgadmin, and then on the learning, if I go ahead and refresh that selected object, I'm going to extend schemas, go to public, and you'll see here down at tables, we have a new table, account. Perfect. So account table has been created, and if we want to, we can expand tables, expand account, and actually see the column names that we just created. So that's how we can create a basic table with some constraints in PostgreSQL. So you can realize it's actually really easy to work with PostgreSQL. So again, it's just create table, the table name, open parentheses, and then you pass in your columns that you want. And it goes the column name, the data type, and then you're going to have the column constraint. And then if you want, additionally, you can have table constraints or inherit from another table, but this is just the basics here. You say create table, the table name, parentheses, and then you're going to have a list separated by commas of all your column names. Oops, just let me expand that. And notice here there's basically a pop-up here so you can like expand and contract this. But you have a user ID, the column name, the data type for that column, and then the column constraints. And you can go ahead and reference either the documentation or the presentation that's actually going to be as a resource attached to this lecture. Okay, so let's go ahead and create another table. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that, and let's create the role table that consists of two columns, just a role ID and a role name. So we'll say create table role, open parentheses. So I create my table, the table name, and then go ahead and think for a second before we start typing this. What is this actually going to look like? Remember, I'm going to need kind of three things in this list. I need my column name, the data type, and then the column constraint. So we'll have role ID and role name as column names. So we'll have role underscore ID. That's my column name, space, the data type here. Again, I'll use serial because it's a convenient integer type that just makes sure I can increment that role ID. And then I'm going to go ahead and say primary key. So I'll have that be the primary key of this table. And then I'll have another column called role name. And who knows what their actual role name is going to be. So it can be like CEO, janitor, who knows, programmer, etc. So let's go ahead and make that a variable character with length, let's say 255. And we'll make sure that they have a unique role name and that their role name is not null. And actually, that's going to be it for the column. So let's go ahead and close off that parentheses, put a semicolon in, and go ahead and create that table. So query returned successfully with no result. Let's go ahead and make sure that the table is created. So if we go back to the learning database, click here on refresh the selected object, scroll down a bit, you'll see tables here. Now we have the account table and the role table. Perfect. So now we have the account table and the role table. And now we're going to go ahead and create our final table, which is going to be account role. And we're going to introduce a couple of new things that we haven't touched on yet, just to show you as kind of an example of what's coming. But we're going to use constraints and references and updates on actions just to show you how you can actually create tables that update on certain actions. So don't worry if you don't understand everything for this final table, but this is kind of almost like a sneak preview of what you're going to be able to do. So I'm going to create table, call it account underscore role, open parentheses here, and let's go ahead and define the column. So I'm going to say user underscore ID. Let's just call it an integer. I'll say not null. We'll also have the role ID. We'll say integer, not null. And then we'll have a grant underscore date timestamp without time zone. And what I'm going to do now is go ahead and then say primary key user underscore ID, comma, role underscore ID, close parentheses, comma. And now I'm going to go ahead and put in some constraints. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this, and you can go ahead and check out the either the resources or the next lecture for all the actual code that we're going to be putting in here. But let me go ahead and paste it in and then explain it. I don't actually want to type it out for you guys because we haven't covered some of this stuff yet, but I just want to explain just a quick example of another method you could create a table that's basically connected to two other tables. So let me go ahead and copy and paste this in here. And there it is, copied and pasted, and it's an example of using constraints. So let me go ahead and examine this statement in a little more detail, but don't worry if you don't fully understand this because we haven't gone over a few of these things yet. The main part to understand is just the first two examples we did, creating a table, table name, the column name, the data type for that column, and then the column constraints. So as long as you understand that, you're good with this lecture and you can move on. What I just want to show you of this is just a quick, simple, or more complicated example of stuff you could actually do later on. So let's go ahead and examine the statement in just a little more detail. We have the primary key of the account role table consists of two columns, user ID and role ID, meaning this primary key, we have user ID and role ID. Therefore, we have to use primary key table level constraint to define the primary key like this. So because the user ID column references to the user ID column in the account table, meaning the user ID column here is going to reference the user ID column in the account table, we need to define a foreign key constraint for the user ID column. And that basically is what's happening if I go ahead and space this out for you here. So we're saying create or constraint account role user ID, foreign key. We define the foreign key as the user ID, show you the references of where it's coming from, so we account user ID, and then we have some other statements there in order to make that happen, which we haven't gone over yet, but I just want to show you what's possible here. If you're already some sort of database administrator, you've seen things like this before, this may be helpful for you in just showing you how PostgreSQL does this sort of work. But if we look at the second statement here, we have the role ID column references the role ID column in the role table, and we also need to define a foreign key constraint for the role ID column, and this is what's happening here. So we say, basically for these two, we set the constraint of the foreign key, we base it off the column that we defined earlier here, and then we give it the reference. So the reference is just references, the table name, and then the column from that table. And then we have some more keywords here with some possibilities for actions in this table when you update it in the other table. Again, don't worry too much of basically what these lines are doing. I just want to show you this as a bit of a precursor to what's going to come into the future. As far as what you should have gotten out of this lecture is just the basics. You should have learned how to use create table, say the table name, and then parentheses, say the column name, the data type, and then some column constraints. Okay, with that being said, we're going to have a quick challenge. Coming up next, just to make sure you understand the basics of creating that table. Okay, so again, don't worry about all this stuff right here. That code's available for you if you want to check it out, but don't worry about it because we're going to discuss a lot of those things later on. Okay, with that being said, thanks everyone, and I will see you at the next lecture.